Sometimes the moment that changes your life isn't dramatic. It's quiet, a feeling, a hesitation, tightening in your chest, a moment where something in you whispers, wait, but almost immediately something else arrives. The explanation, the justification, the minimization, the bargaining. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe they don't mean it like that. Maybe I'm just too sensitive. Maybe I just need to be more understanding. And before you even realize what happened, you've moved away from yourself. Not all at once, but moment by moment. This episode is about that moment, the moment that you override yourself before you realize that you're doing it, and what it cost to repeatedly disconnect from your own signals in order to preserve connection, certainty, hope, identity, or the version of reality that you desperately want to believe in. Welcome back to The Void and the Flame. I'm Rachel, or Ray, and today we're talking about the moment that people override themselves. The moment that discomfort appears and the mind rushes in to just explain it away. And we're not doing this to shame others, not to turn every uncomfortable interaction into a red flag, but to slow the process down enough to finally see it clearly. It's a moment that most people move through automatically because override happens fast. So fast, in fact, that most people don't realize that they've abandoned themselves until long after the moment has passed. And the difficult part is that override rarely feels dangerous when it's happening. Usually it feels reasonable. And that's what we're going to unpack today. I think one of the hardest things about self-abandonment is that it usually doesn't feel like self-abandonment while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels pretty normal, pretty just reasonable, justifiable, because override happens in micro moments, tiny negotiations against yourself. Like laughing when something actually hurts, saying it's fine when it isn't, just explaining away inconsistency, talking yourself out of discomfort, or convincing yourself to tolerate something that your body already feels unsettled by. And I think many people miss these moments because they're waiting for dysfunction to look obvious. But often the shift is really subtle. It's not one giant betrayal. Repeated moments of slowly stopping listening to yourself. Now, if override felt obviously harmful, most people would probably stop. But override rarely arrives as self-betrayal, or let alone announces, hey, we're going to betray ourselves today. More times than not, it arrives as understanding, as patience, empathy, being flexible, as hope. Sometimes it even arrives wearing the face of maturity. You tell yourself, oh, relationships are complicated. No one's perfect. They're trying. I just need to communicate better. And maybe I misunderstood. I know that they've been through a lot. And to be clear, sometimes those things are true. This isn't about becoming cold or suspicious. It's not about assuming the worst. It's about noticing the moment understanding turns into self-disconnection. Because there is a difference between compassion and abandoning your own reality to preserve someone else's. And here's the part that makes this even harder to untangle. The brain is not actually reacting most times to what's happening. It's predicting it. So your nervous system is constantly running pattern recognition, scanning for familiar dynamics, matching current moments to old experiences, and generating an explanation before the situation has even fully resolved. Which means sometimes the override feels completely logical, not because the current moment is actually threatening, but because it rhymes with something that was. Your nervous system is pulling from a very old, very convincing file, and the explanation it hands you feels true because somewhere in your history, it was. So you explain, reframe, contextualize, soften, minimize. And not because you're stupid, not because you're weak, because human beings are deeply wired to preserve attachment, coherence, and emotional stability. And sometimes the explanation arrives before the feelings have even fully formed. That's why override can feel so convincing, because part of you genuinely believes you're being loving and reasonable, fair, patient, understanding, evolved. And maybe part of you is. But another part of you may already be tightening internally, trying to signal this doesn't actually feel okay. And this becomes even harder to recognize when override is connected to identity. Because sometimes acknowledging the truth doesn't only threaten the relationship, it threatens the version of yourself that you've built your life around. The understanding one, the helper, the easygoing one, the loyal one, the one who sees the best in people, and the one who can handle difficult things. So instead of questioning the situation, you question yourself. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe I just need to try harder. And little by little, the explanation becomes louder than the signal itself. Also, I want to say this clearly. For some people, this wasn't just a pattern that developed, it was a requirement. If you grew up in any kind of environment where your reality wasn't safe to express, where saying this doesn't feel right had real consequences, then override wasn't a nervous system quirk. It was how you stayed safe. And the fact that it followed you out of that environment doesn't mean that you failed. It means the strategy worked well enough that your nervous system kept using it. That deserves acknowledgement, not shame. If you've been following along with past episodes, you know that I have said probably a few times that the body often notices something long before the mind is willing to organize it into truth. And most people have been trained to trust the explanation faster than the sensation. So the body speaks quietly at first, not in full sentences, in signals. Tension, hesitation, exhaustion that doesn't fully make sense. A subtle dread before certain conversations, maybe relief when plans get canceled that you thought you wanted. The tightening in your chest when someone's name appears on your phone, the rehearsing before interactions, the over-preparing, the mental looping afterwards, the way your body braces before certain people even speak. And because these responses become familiar, many people stop recognizing them as information. They start treating them almost like personalities. I'm just anxious. I'm an overthinker. I'm really emotional. I'm really bad at conflict. Or my personal favorite, I just care too much. But sometimes what you're calling personality is actually prolonged adaptation. your body trying to manage what your mind keeps attempting to normalize. And this is where override creates a pretty painful internal split. One part of you feels something clearly, while another part immediately moves into trying to explain it, minimize it, contextualize it, or suppress it. So now you're holding two realities at once: what your body knows and what your narrative is trying to preserve. The split creates exhaustion, not out of weakness, but because maintaining disconnection from yourself takes enormous amounts of energy. And this isn't just emotional. The body keeps a running tab on what it's been asked to hold. Chronic self-suppression has a psychological cost. The nervous system running on low-grade threat indefinitely doesn't just produce anxiety. It produces fatigue, physical depletion, a kind of bone tiredness that sleep doesn't always fix. I felt that. Your system wasn't designed to override itself indefinitely. It was designed to complete the signal, not suppress it. And over time, people become so practiced at overriding signals that they stop realizing how often they are internally negotiating against themselves. They explain away the exhaustion and push through discomfort and override limits before they have even fully formed. Laugh while their body is tightening. Say yes while something inside of them is saying no. And the difficult part is that none of this necessarily looks harmful or dramatic from the outside. Many people appear highly functional while quietly disconnected from themselves every day. They perform competence, they perform certainty, they perform calm. While internally, their system is constantly compensating, bracing, adjusting, or self-editing in order to maintain stability. And eventually, the body starts finding other ways to communicate through burnout, numbness, resentment, emotional validity, through shutdown, through anxiety that seems to appear out of nowhere. Not because the body is trying to betray you, but because it's trying to get your attention. And once you begin recognizing these patterns, something very important starts to shift. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What have I been repeatedly overriding that my body has been trying to show me?" That question changes everything, because now the signal is no longer invisible. When most people hear conversations like this, they might picture override happening quietly. The people pleasing, freezing, shrinking, explaining things away. And yes, override can absolutely look like that, but not everyone disconnects from themselves by becoming smaller. We've talked about this in one of the previous episodes. Some people actually disconnect from themselves by becoming louder, more reactive, more controlling, more defensive. And not everyone overrides through collapse. Some people override through force, because override is not about personality, it's about protection. And protection takes different shapes in different nervous systems. And for some people, discomfort turns inwards. They question themselves, minimize themselves, silence themselves. But for others, discomfort moves outward. They attack, they deflect, they dominate the conversation, become emotionally sharp, try to regain control of the moment before vulnerability can fully land. Some people override by disappearing. Others override by overpowering. But underneath both responses, something very similar is often happening. The nervous system detects threat. and moves automatically to regain safety, certainty, control, or stability. And sometimes that looks like maybe I'm the problem. And sometimes it looks like, no, you're the problem. Different strategies, same survival urgency. And this matters because many people spend their lives only recognizing override in the ways that they personally express it. So they notice their freezing and their overthinking, their self-abandonment, while completely missing that the ways they may also control or dismiss, interrupt, invalidate, or maybe even emotionally escalate when discomfort appears. Because once one protection activates, self-awareness often narrows. Not because people are evil and not because they're incapable of change, but because survival responses prioritize protection over reflection. And this is where the work becomes deeper and more honest. Because returning to yourself doesn't only mean noticing where you disappear. It also means noticing where you stop listening, where you become reactive instead of present, when your need for certainty becomes stronger than your willingness to stay conscious. That can be difficult to face, especially because most people can recognize the pain of their softer survival patterns long before they recognize the impact of their harder ones. But awareness is not meant to be self-condemnation. It's meant to create choice. Because once you can see the pattern, you're no longer completely inside of it. Not every reaction means someone is unsafe. Not every freeze means someone is weak, and not every defensive response means someone is malicious. Human beings become many different things while trying to protect pain they don't know yet how to hold consciously. That doesn't excuse harm, but it does create understanding. Because if we only recognize survival patterns in the people that we feel compassion for while demonizing them in the people who trigger us, then we are not actually seeing clearly yet. We're still sorting humanity into safe and unsafe categories fast enough to avoid actually sitting with complexity. But real awareness asks more from us than that. It asks us to become honest enough to recognize protection in all of its forms, including the forms that are harder to admit live inside of ourselves. Because override is not a character flaw. It's what happens when protection becomes more automatic than presence. Another difficult thing about override that I touched on very briefly in the beginning is that the cost usually doesn't appear immediately. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happens in the moment, like we've said. We've noticed that so far, right? The conversations could continue, the relationship continues, life continues. And because there's no obvious collapse, people assume I'm fine. It wasn't a big deal. I handled that. But override accumulates. Not always through major betrayals, through small disconnections repeated over time. The laugh that wasn't real, the yes that wasn't honest, the exhaustion that you ignored and brushed away, or the discomfort that you just explained away. Maybe the truth that you softened before you could allow it to fully form. And eventually, something inside you starts becoming harder to hear clearly. Because every time that you override your own signal, you teach yourself, don't fully trust that feeling. Don't fully trust that reaction. Ultimately, don't fully trust yourself. That repetition matters. Self-trust doesn't usually fracture all at once. It fractures slowly, moment by moment, override by override. And over time, many people begin living in a constant internal negotiation with themselves, part of them feels something and another part immediately just explains it away. One part wants rest while another part says push harder. One part feels hurt and another part says, you're just being a baby. And that constant self-negotiation creates exhaustion that most people can't fully name. Not from weakness, but because internal fragmentation is tiring. There's a loneliness that develops when you repeatedly leave yourself behind. And what makes it especially painful is that many people continue functioning normally while it's happening. They continue to work and show up and maintain relationships and just keep moving. But underneath all of that movement, they feel disconnected, emotionally foggy, restless, numb, quietly resentful, strangely absent from their own lives. And many people don't realize that what they're grieving is actually themselves, the part that they stopped listening to, the needs that they minimized, the instincts that they repeatedly overruled, the aliveness that they slowly negotiated away in order to maintain stability, approval, identity, or attachment. And I want to be honest with you about something. When I first started recognizing this in myself, like really recognizing it, it was not empowering. It was actually quite gutting. Because once you can see how long something has been running, how many moments, how many years, how many versions of yourself quietly left the room so someone else could feel comfortable, there's a lot of grief in that. A lot of really real grief. Not dramatic, not a breakdown, just quiet, heavy. The kind that just sits in your chest when you finally understand what you were doing to yourself and why. And I still feel it sometimes. I don't say that to alarm you by any means. I say it because I think it's important that you know if that grief shows up for you, that's not a sign that something went wrong. It's a sign that something is finally being seen and heard. This is where awareness becomes painful. Because once you begin noticing override, you can no longer fully disappear unconsciously inside it. You start catching the moment, the explanation, the tightening, the self-editing, the almost automatic move away from yourself. And at first, that awareness can feel pretty overwhelming. Because now you can see how you've often participated in your own disconnection. Not intentionally or maliciously, but definitely repeatedly. Awareness is not failure. It's the beginning of relationship returning. I gotta be real with you. If you're anything like me, once you begin noticing override, there can be a very real temptation to just immediately try to stop doing it. To just monitor yourself constantly and to analyze every interaction, to question every interaction, and to force yourself into perfect awareness. But that usually becomes just another form of disconnection. Because the goal is not to become hyper-controlled. The goal is to just become more present. And presence grows slowly, especially in places where your nervous system learned that disconnecting was safer. So the return to yourself does not usually begin through some dramatic transformation. It just begins quietly in very small moments. The moment that you notice your body is tightening before you automatically say yes. The moment you realize that you're explaining something you don't actually need to defend. The moment that you pause long enough to ask, what am I actually feeling right now? And I want to try to describe what that pause actually feels like, because I think this part gets skipped a lot. It's not some like crazy in your face thing, and it doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It's more like you hear yourself about to say to somebody, "I'm fine." And something in you goes quiet for a moment instead of loud, and you're almost like, "Am I fine?" Just a half second, a small hesitation where you don't immediately leave. It doesn't feel like healing. It just feels like a little more honest than a moment ago. And at first, that can feel surprisingly unfamiliar because many people have spent years relating to themselves through correction instead of curiosity. So when awareness first returns, people often become harsh with themselves. I can't believe I still do this. I used to use that one a lot, actually. Um, how did I not notice this before? Just use that phrase today, riding home with my buddy Lisa. Hey, Lisa. Um, I'm telling her a story, and I'm like, how did I not notice? Sometimes you don't. I should be further along. Man, do I feel that a lot. And I know better than this. Yeah, sometimes we do. And here's what I want to say to that gently, but directly. You're going to override yourself again. I guarantee it. After this episode, maybe today, probably this week. And that's not failure. That is not evidence that this work isn't working. That is what nervous systems do while they're still learning something new. How long does it take to create a new habit? 21 days? Last time I checked, who knows? They change things so often. Anyways, the goal is not to never override yourself again. The goal is not to never do any of these things that we talk about in this podcast again, because that's unrealistic. The goal is just to catch it sooner, to come back faster, to make the gap between leaving yourself and noticing that you've left a little smaller each time. You do not need to shame yourself for the ways that you've learned to survive. You do not need to become perfect overnight to begin changing your relationship with yourself. Because self-punishment does not create lasting change. Most of the time, it creates more hiding and more performance, more disconnection. Real change usually begins when honesty becomes survivable. When you can look clearly without collapsing. When you can notice a pattern without turning yourself into a problem. When you can say, yes, this exists, and I want to relate to it differently. That's the threshold. That's where the return becomes possible. I sometimes feel like when people hear conversations like this, they assume the goal is to become perfectly healed, perfectly regulated, perfectly self-aware. But that's not really what returning to yourself looks like. Most of the time, it looks much quieter than that. It looks like less internal fighting, less convincing, less negotiating against your own reality. You stop spending so much energy trying to override what you feel. And slowly, the energy becomes available again for living, for presence, for creativity, for honesty, for rest, for connection, for joy that actually lands in your body. Because something very subtle begins to happen when you stop abandoning yourself automatically. Life starts feeling more real. Not easier all the time, and definitely not perfect, but real. Your yes begins to feel cleaner. Your no begins to feel clearer. Your relationships become more honest, and your body becomes less confusing. Not because you suddenly know everything, but because you stop constantly arguing with your own signals. And maybe one of the biggest shifts is this. You begin realizing how much of your life was spent trying to maintain versions of yourself that were built around survival. The version that kept the peace, the version that stayed agreeable, the version that overperformed, the version that stayed emotionally guarded, the version that tried to become what other people needed. And as all those layers begin loosening, something underneath them starts to begin breathing again. Curiosity, aliveness, presence, desire, humor, creativity, stillness. I feel like awe, too, returns. You begin noticing what actually nourishes you and what drains you, what expands you, what contracts you, what feels true, and what only feels familiar. And this is where life can start becoming surprisingly simple again. Not because the world becomes simple, but because you stop fighting yourself inside of it constantly. You stop needing every decision to become an identity crisis. You stop performing connection while quietly disappearing inside of it. You stop chasing certainty at the expense of truth. And maybe for the first time, you begin building a life that actually feels inhabitable to your nervous system. Not just impressive from the outside, not just survivable, actually livable. And something else changes too. The way that you move through other people. Because when you become more honest with yourself, you stop needing as much performance from others. You become less reactive to discomfort, less desperate for validation, less dependent on constant external confirmation to feel steady internally. Not because you stopped needing people, but because you stopped abandoning yourself inside your relationships with them. And that changes the kind of presence that you bring into the world. You listen differently and you respond differently. You model something different. Not perfection, not superiority, just presence. The kind that quietly gives other people permission to become more honest too. And maybe that's the real shift. Not becoming someone new entirely, but finally becoming someone you can fully exist as without constantly leaving yourself behind. And maybe this is where we pause for now. Not because the work is finished, because awareness needs space to settle. Because once you begin recognizing override, you start seeing it everywhere. In conversations, in relationships, in your body, your decisions, in the quiet moments where you almost disappear automatically. And the goal is not to become hyper aware of every flaw or every reaction or every uncomfortable feeling. The goal is to become conscious enough to stay in relationship with yourself while life is happening. That's the difference. In the next episode, we're going to move deeper into what happens when awareness begins changing the way that you relate to other people. What becomes visible when you stop explaining everything away. The patterns, the mismatches, the moments that your body knew before your mind caught up. Not to make you fearful or suspicious, but to help you build discernment without abandoning compassion. Because clarity is not cruelty and awareness is not judgment. Sometimes it's simply the moment that you finally stop arguing with what you already know. But for now, just notice. Notice where you feel yourself throughout your day. Notice the moments where you leave yourself automatically. Notice the moments where you stay. That's enough. That's already the beginning. Now, before we leave, I want to leave you with this. Most people were never taught how to stay connected to themselves while navigating discomfort, conflict, uncertainty, or attachment. I know I sure wasn't. Most people were taught how to adapt, how to perform, and how to survive. So if you recognize yourself in this episode, whether it be in the explaining, the override, the self-editing, the shrinking, reacting, convincing, whatever it might be, just please know that that doesn't make you broken. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It just makes you human. And becoming aware of those patterns is not something to be ashamed of. Awareness is where relationship begins returning. Not relationship to an idealized version of yourself, or relationship to the real one. The one underneath the performance, underneath the fear, underneath the adaptations or the survival strategies that you once needed in order to keep going. And maybe the work isn't becoming someone entirely different. Maybe the work is learning how to stop leaving yourself behind again and again and again. With honesty, with responsibility, with compassion, with presence. Because you do not need to become perfect to begin returning to yourself. You only need the willingness to notice when you disappear and the gentleness to come back. Until next time, you are allowed to exist honestly inside your own life. And remember, you don't have to keep the fire lit alone.